There are some things I wish Jesus had not said with such unequivocal, straightforward, unambiguous clarity. And among them are verses 9 and 10 of today's reading from Luke 11. I tell you, says Jesus, ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and it will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives, and he who seeks finds, and to him who knocks it will be opened. That's a grand promise. And I believe that Jesus meant it when he said it, and I further believe it myself. But I still wish he had not said it in such an unconditional and bold fashion. Since Jesus makes that unequivocal statement right in the middle of his teaching about prayer, it suggests, as I said to the children a moment ago, that praying to God might serve our wants like Aladdin's magic lamp. You rub it 3 times, you say abracadabra, and God, like a genie, grants your wish at your command. There's no nuance in those 2 verses to suggest that a person may have to ask more than once to get what they're after, or that they have to seek longer and harder than they really care to do, or that they will have to knock boldly, persistently, to the point of obnoxious in order to be heard. If those verses are lifted out from this chapter, lifted out as though it was a standalone promise made by God, this saying, taken literally and in good faith, without any exceptions or nuances of any kind, may generate a great deal of disappointment for the person who's praying sincerely, asking for something in Jesus' name, but it's something that they do not get. The cancer is still there, even after the prayer. The job you wanted goes to a competitor. The dam burst after all. Your loved one dies anyway. Didn't Jesus promise a better outcome if we would ask in his name? Aren't we supposed to get what we ask for in prayer? People seek for what they need, and like Bono sings in the U2 song, I haven't found what I'm looking for. They knock, as in today's parable, only to be rebuffed by the householder, refused, locked out. You can see why I say I wish Jesus had not been so all-encompassing, unconditional, and positive when he said, I tell you, ask and it will be given you. Seek and you will find. Knock and it will be open to you. Unequivocal clarity like that triggers natural skepticism in some people. It ain't necessarily so. If you take Jesus at his word, every unopened door feels like a failure to the one who's been doing the knocking. Every unsuccessful seeking, every unanswered ask drives their doubt and their disillusionment deeper. So I would like to have us take that single saying and put it back into its context in Luke's gospel, as well as into its historical context, because that can help us to restore the logic and the impact of Jesus' whole teaching, and rescue this saying from the absurd exaggeration which can be so off-putting when it's taken out of context, as unfortunately so often it is. Professor Bart Ehrman, whose DVD lectures on the New Testament constitute our Thursday theology class, said just this week that one of the major criteria scholars use to examine gospel stories to see how much historical source is there is called contextual credibility. Traditions and sayings that are attributed to Jesus have to be situated, he says, credibly into what we know to be the context of Judaism in the 1st century A.D. in Palestine. And that sounds confusing, but that's really what I want us to do this morning. The text that we just heard starts by observing Jesus praying. He's praying in a certain place. And when he ceased praying, one of the disciples said to him, "Lord, teach us to pray, as John taught his disciples." You see, Jesus' disciples saw him praying, and maybe they even heard his words from time to time. They would have seen, as Karen Bacon led us last Sunday, they would have seen whether he folded his hands or pointed them upward or raised his hands to heaven. They would have seen him if he fell to his knees or if he bowed his head. And one of them, at least, asked Jesus to teach them to do the same. And I presume that some of Jesus' other disciples were also interested in learning how to pray, but I notice they have not done so for the 10 chapters preceding today's text. See, prayer was simply not the thing the disciples were doing. It was something Jesus did, but they didn't. In the Gospels, Jesus prays frequently, but we never see his disciples do so. Even on the very last night when they were together, they went to the Garden of Gethsemane after the Lord's Last Supper, and Jesus asked them, "Stay awake with me and pray." They did neither. They slept while Jesus prayed alone to his Father, asking for help, seeking relief, but to no avail. Getting back to today's text, Jesus begins his instruction by giving his disciples a much shorter, easier, and probably earlier version of the Lord's Prayer than the more familiar one that we find in Matthew's Gospel. That's the one we use every Sunday morning during worship. It's printed in the bulletin. But in Luke's Gospel, Jesus says, and I quote, "When you pray, say, 'Father, hallowed be thy name. Give us each day our daily bread, and forgive us our sins, for we ourselves forgive everyone who's indebted to us, and lead us not into temptation.'" That's 37 words, as opposed to our usual 64. We address God, who is the Holy One, and we ask for 3 things. Give us bread, forgive us our sins, and spare us from being tested or tempted. Give us sustenance, forgive our shortcomings, and God, don't put us to the test. After all, we're just learning how to pray, right? Unlike the longer, more familiar version in Matthew's Sermon on the Mount, Luke links the Lord's Prayer to a somewhat humorous parable about a villager who asks for bread from a reluctant neighbor. And that story ties into the saying which follows immediately, the saying we were just talking about. The villager comes to his neighbor at midnight, asking for bread, seeking to borrow 3 loaves, and knocking at his neighbor's door. So according to Jesus' saying, the only appropriate response from the householder would be you give what they're asking for. You help find what they're seeking. You open the door to the person who knocks, period. Everyone in the audience would know that. It's basic hospitality. It's what would be expected in the village. To do less than that would be ungracious. It would be ungenerous. In fact, it would have been insulting. So, the unexpected surprise in this parable, the twist in the story that would have made Jesus' audience shake their heads, is that the person asking for bread was refused. "Do not bother me," is the neighbor's response. Now, while you and I, in our modern market-driven economy, expect people to get what they deserve, they get what they've earned, they get what they can pay for, this "do not bother me" response seems fairly common. It seems quite natural, doesn't it? Look, your problem is not my problem. Go away. Right? What's in it for me? Get out of here. This, however, would have been unheard of under the norms of Jewish hospitality, which are patterned after the hospitality that Abraham extended to his visitors. You may remember the story in Genesis chapter 18 when the Lord and two angels were passing by Abraham on their way to investigate the city of Sodom, which they had heard is a very unhospitable place. Abraham invited them to come into his tent, sit in the shade of the oak at Mamre. He made some bread. He killed the fatted calf, and he barbecued it, and he had conversation with them over a meal, a very significant conversation. That's how things were done in rural Israel. And the custom of hospitality became codified in Torah law. For example, every third-year tithe and some other provisions of justice were explicitly set aside in a common storehouse like our United Way does, that stuff the bus thing, right? And they would put it aside specifically to support landless Levites, widows and orphans, resident aliens, and sojourning strangers. That's what the common pot was for. In Leviticus 19:34, for example, Jews are instructed to provide hospitality towards strangers. You shall love the alien as you love yourself, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. This unexpected guest in Jesus' parable, who arrives in the middle of the night, is more like a visitor, that is a sojourner, an alien, a tourist, more so than like a native villager. The home that opens itself to take in a visitor, like the carriage house at the Aitons, also finds out they have to care for that person. Have coffee in the morning, and have a bagel for breakfast. That's the custom. Furthermore, every Jewish villager knew that the grapes that had fallen in the vineyard and the crop